"You're not family," Paige said, her voice flat and deliberate, like she'd rehearsed it. Then she shut the door. Not slammed, just firm enough that I heard the latch click. That sound was louder than any argument we could have had. I stood on the porch for a few seconds, holding the basket of deviled eggs in one hand and the carrot cake in the other. The eggs were still warm. The frosting had set just right. I'd piped little sugared carrots on top, the way Carter liked when he was a boy. The porch light above me buzzed faintly. I didn't knock again. I didn't ring the bell. I turned and walked back down the steps, careful not to stumble. The air had that cool spring bite, but I didn't feel it. My chest was burning, not from anger, not even sadness yet, just something hollow and hot that had no name. Back at home, the front door was still unlocked. I stepped inside and set the food on the kitchen counter. The table was already set. Linen runner pastel plates, folded napkins in the shape of lilies. I'd even tied name cards with ribbon out of habit. I stood there, looking at it all. Then I pulled off my coat, hung it neatly, and sat down at the head of the table. For a while I didn't move. I didn't cry either. I just sat. Still dressed for company. The only sound was the tick of the wall clock. It was a good 10 minutes before my phone buzzed. "Carter, sorry. Things got complicated." That was it. No explanation, no apology. Just a sentence with the warmth wrung out of it. I stared at the screen. Then I hit delete. The message disappeared without a trace, like it had never existed. I walked to the window, slid it open, and let the night air in. The room felt too full of something invisible. Disappointment, maybe. I left the table untouched and went upstairs, closing the door behind me without switching off the light. There was a time when Easter meant Carter would burst through the door with a paper-wrapped bouquet and a sheepish grin, dropping his bag by the door and kissing my cheek before I could scold him for being late. Always tulips. Always yellow. Now the tulips sat in a vase I'd bought for myself. I had arranged everything, just so the pale linen runner, the ceramic rabbit centerpiece I found years ago at a flea market, the place cards written in my own careful hand. The ham had finished baking an hour ago. The glaze had set perfectly. The cinnamon rolls were still warm, though the tops had begun to harden. No one had touched a single plate. I poured a glass of water and sat down at the table without ceremony. I didn't light the candles. I didn't even lift a fork. I just looked at the setting and imagined how it could have felt. If they'd walked in, if Carter had changed his mind, if Paige had opened the door instead of closing it. I closed my eyes, but it didn't help. The silence filled in every gap like water rising in a sealed room. My hand hovered over the phone, thinking maybe I'd call Grace or one of the ladies from the community garden. But the thought of explaining anything made my stomach twist. I didn't want to be comforted. I didn't want the kind of sympathy that came with tilted heads and quiet sighs. I wanted the ache to stop. I stood up, walked to the oven, and turned it off completely. No reason to keep the warmth going. The rolls would go stale by morning. The ham would keep in the fridge. The carrot cake still sat untouched under its glass dome, too sweet for a day like this. I left the kitchen window open and let the cool air curl around the curtains. It smelled like cinnamon-baked sugar, and something else I couldn't name, something like the ghost of laughter. The doorbell rang just after 3. I almost didn't answer it, but then I saw the familiar silhouette through the glass. Grace with her oversized sunglasses and that Tupperware container she always reused, no matter how stained the lid got. "I brought lemon bars," she said, nudging past me without waiting for an invitation. "I figured you'd be pretending not to be sad, and I figured I'd ignore it." I let the door close behind her and followed her into the kitchen, where the air still held the faint trace of Easter cinnamon ham sugar. Something warm that no longer belonged to me. She set the container on the counter, peeled back the lid, and then looked at me. Really looked. "Where are they?" she asked softly. "They're not coming." I didn't mean to say it so plainly, but the words came out flat. I leaned against the counter and stared down at my hands. They looked older than I remembered. Grace didn't blink. Why, I swallowed hard. My voice didn't crack, it just dropped low like I was whispering something shameful. Paige said, "I'm not family." For a moment, the only sound was the refrigerator humming. Then Grace exhaled slow and sharp. "That girl wouldn't know family if it tucked her in every night. You raised that boy. You sent him to college. You're the reason they have a life to celebrate." I gave her a small, bitter laugh. "Maybe it's not about me anymore." Grace moved closer, her tone gentler but firmer. "Then make it about someone who wants to show up." I looked at her, not quite understanding. She reached for a knife, cut one of the lemon bars, and handed it to me like it was a dare. "You always said Easter was about love," she said. "So give it. Just not to people who keep shutting you out." I took the lemon bar but didn't bite. I just stood there, holding it, feeling its weight in my palm. Later that night, I sat alone again, staring at the cold table and thinking of Grace's words. I didn't clear the table. I couldn't. It felt like sweeping away what was left of the day, and I wasn't ready to erase it. Instead, I reached behind the pantry door and took down my apron, the one with the embroidered violets near the hem. I tied it slowly, like I was remembering how to move. I didn't bake out of tradition this time. I wasn't making carrot cake or Parker House rolls or anything Paige might have called dated. I just pulled ingredients out by instinct: flour, brown sugar, eggs. The oven clicked on and began to hum again. My hands moved without a recipe. While the butter softened, I sat down at the table and stared at my phone. Grace's words hadn't left me. I opened the Notes app first and typed a single sentence. "If you're spending Easter alone, my door's open at noon." Then I copied it into Facebook. I stared at the screen for 10 minutes, reading it over and over. It didn't say why. It didn't accuse. It didn't beg. It just opened a door. My finger hovered, then tapped. Post. The message was out there now, floating in timelines and algorithms, probably buried under brunch photos and egg hunts and Paige's curated perfection. I got up and checked the cookies. Still silence. I told myself I didn't care if no one saw it, that I'd still bake, that the smell of cinnamon and browned butter was enough company for one Sunday. Then ping. A comment. Just a heart emoji from an old student named Jenna. Ping. Another. Does it matter if we've never met? I live a few blocks away. I smiled, faint and unsure. No, I typed back. It doesn't matter at all. The oven timer went off. I slipped the trays out and set them on the counter to cool. The warmth in the kitchen didn't feel so false anymore. I walked to the window and opened it again. This time the breeze carried something softer than silence. I turned back to my phone and watched the pings multiply. At 12:07, I heard it a knock, soft but certain. I wiped my hands on the apron and walked to the door. My heart thudding like it didn't believe what my ears had caught. It was Ramon, our mail carrier. He held a small bouquet of wildflowers, their stems wrapped in a damp paper towel and foil. "You said anyone could come," he said, a little shy, his eyes scanning the porch like maybe he was early or mistaken. I smiled. "Then come in. You're right on time." He stepped inside, slowly, taking in the scent of cinnamon, the clatter from the kitchen, the table still dressed in soft pinks and pale greens. I offered him coffee. He offered to help. At 12:23, there was another knock. It was Mireya from the grocery store. She held a foil-covered tray, and her teenage daughter stood behind her, eyes wide. "I brought tamales," she said. "You really meant it, I did." By 12:40, the hallway smelled like masa and cloves. Grace came back with a bowl of deviled eggs and a stack of paper napkins with watercolor birds on them. Figured you'd need reinforcements, she said with a wink. Pastor Drew arrived next, then one of his choir members and her husband. A man I vaguely recognized from the pharmacy brought a tub of macaroni salad. Chairs appeared from neighbors' garages. Someone connected a speaker to their phone, and soft jazz drifted into the room. I kept cooking, kept smiling, kept watching the empty spaces fill. There was no head of the table now, just hands passing plates, voices overlapping, someone laughing so hard they had to set their glass down. The clink of forks against china. The scrape of a chair as someone shifted closer. No one asked why I'd posted what I did. No one tiptoed around it. They just showed up, took their seat, and made room for the next soul who might wander in. And when I stepped back and looked at that crowded, noisy table, I didn't feel like someone who had been left behind. I felt like someone who had chosen to stay. It was somewhere between the second round of tamales and Grace telling a story about her first disastrous Easter ham that someone at the table laughed and said, "This belongs in a movie." I looked up. The room was full, not politely. Full, truly full. Jackets draped over chairs, baskets, already half-emptied plates being passed from hand to hand. Ramon was showing wildflower photos to Mireya's daughter. Pastor Drew was helping someone slice the carrot cake. The house, which had felt like an echo chamber that morning, now hummed with the kind of warmth you don't plan. You just feel. I stood there for a moment, my hands still dusted with flour, and let my eyes travel across every face. None of them were obligated to be here. None of them had to answer that post. But they had. Every single one of them had walked through my door like it was the most natural thing in the world. Maybe that was why I reached for my phone. I didn't think too hard. If I had, I might have talked myself out of it. Instead, I set the phone on a small stand near the counter and adjusted it so the room, this impossible, beautiful room, filled the frame. Then I pressed, "Go live." The camera opened, and I stepped into view, wiping my palms on my apron. "Hello, everyone." I said, my voice steadier than I expected. I wasn't supposed to host anyone today. Behind me, someone held up a plate and waved. Laughter rippled through the room, but it turns out love doesn't need a bloodline. Sometimes it just needs a door that stays open. People called out greetings. Someone clinked a glass. The comments started to pop up on the screen, little hearts floating past my shoulder. Then I saw it. A small name in the corner. Paige Monroe is watching. My breath hitched, but only for a second. I didn't acknowledge it. I didn't change my tone. I simply stepped aside so the camera could see the table, see every person who had shown up when I thought no one would, while the room kept filling with voices that carried me into the rest of the afternoon. I didn't say her name. Not once during the stream. Not Carter's either. I talked about cinnamon rolls and folding chairs, about how Easter doesn't ask for matching napkins or perfect families, just a table and someone willing to share it. I let the camera capture what mattered: the clatter of spoons, the way Ramon laughed with his whole chest, the tamales that vanished within minutes, the songs humming low in the background. Real things. And when it was time to end, I looked straight into the lens and said, "If today was hard for you, know you're not alone. There's more room at more tables than you think. Thank you for spending some of it with us." Then I pressed. End Live set the phone down and exhaled. For a long time, no one said anything. There was just the music, the laughter, the low chatter of people who hadn't known each other this morning, but now passed dishes like old friends. I felt lighter. Not healed, not fixed, but something had lifted. Then my phone buzzed. A message from Carter. "We saw it. We're coming." No punctuation, no apology. Just those words. I stared at the screen. My fingers tingled. My chest tightened, unsure whether it was dread curling up in my lungs or something closer to hope. Grace leaned over. "Everything okay?" I nodded too quickly. Do you need a second? I shook my head. What I needed was time. But time wasn't something you could stretch or pause. It came when it wanted dragging everything with it. I turned the phone face down on the counter and looked back at my guests. No one had left. They were still there, laughing, refilling glasses, wiping their mouths on paper napkins, complimenting the ham. All I could do was let the moment hold while I figured out what came next. And in that stretch of not knowing, someone knocked on the door again. At exactly 7, I heard the car doors shut. I didn't rush to the window. I didn't adjust my hair or wipe my hands. I just stood there still until the knock came soft, like they weren't sure they were allowed to be loud anymore. When I opened the door, Carter was there, first holding a basket of daisies and a foil-covered dish that steamed through its seams. Paige stood beside him. Her eyes were swollen. Her coat still buttoned to the top, like she hadn't breathed since this morning. No one said anything at first. Then Carter nodded once. Hi, Mom. I opened the door wider. He stepped inside, glancing at the chairs, now pushed back the empty plates, stacked near the sink, the faint hum of the dishwasher running its second load. Paige lingered a step behind. When she finally entered, she looked around slowly at the folded napkins, the tulips still fresh by the window, the smudged glass where a child had pressed their hand earlier. Her voice, when it came, was barely more than a whisper. I saw them smiling, she said. The people in your video. I saw you smiling too. Her chin trembled. I didn't understand what real family looked like until that moment. I didn't reach for her. I didn't cry. I just nodded once and led them both to the table where the carrot cake sat half-eaten, but still beautiful. I pulled out the 2 remaining clean plates and placed them down without a word. Carter sat first. Paige sat next to him slowly, like she was afraid the chair might not hold her. They didn't say much. Neither did I. But I poured coffee-cut slices of cake and let the warmth do what words couldn't. Every bite, every quiet glance was a kind of glue, soft and slow patching what had cracked but hadn't yet broken. And just when I thought we might stay in that silence forever, Paige reached for the dish towel and said softly, "Let me help." The kitchen filled with the hush of doing. Paige rolled up her sleeves, and I passed her the dish towel without a word. Carter stood at the sink sleeves, damp, his hands already slick with soap. I scraped the last of the mashed potatoes into a container and sealed it tight. We moved in a rhythm I didn't think we'd ever find again. No speeches, no explanations, just the soft sounds of plates clinking and water running. There was a comfort in the quiet. Not peace, not yet, but effort. Honest, necessary effort. Carter dried his hands and leaned against the counter. That video, he said, glancing toward the phone still charging by the window. It's been shared a few thousand times now. A friend at work sent it to me this afternoon, didn't even know it was you until I clicked. He smiled, small and sheepish. You're kind of a hit. I laughed lightly, shaking my head. Not what I planned for Easter. Paige looked up from folding the napkins. People need to see what you showed, she said. Not just kindness, but how to make space for it. She said it carefully, without pushing too far. Then, as she wiped down the table, she added, "Can we come next Sunday? I'd like to bring dessert." I paused at the stove, stirring the leftover gravy to keep it from hardening. I turned slowly and met her eyes. "You'll need my recipe," I said. Her face softened, and Carter looked at her the way I hadn't seen in a long time, like he remembered what brought them together in the first place. Something unspoken settled into the room. Not forgiveness. Not yet, but something that made space for it. I handed her the old note card from the recipe box, the one stained in the corners from years of use. She held it like it mattered. And together, without saying it, we began to stitch something back together, quietly, gently. One clean dish, one folded napkin at a time. Later that night after they left, I walked through the house in soft steps and reached for the porch light switch. The morning came soft. I stepped into the kitchen barefoot, the tile cool under my feet. The smell of last night's still lingered coffee sugar, a hint of rosemary from the roast. The flowers on the windowsill hadn't wilted. A cookie half-eaten sat on a napkin, folded neatly beside an empty teacup. The silence felt different now. Not heavy, but full. Like the house had exhaled. I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat where Paige had been the night before. I traced the rim of her mug with one finger, remembering how she had picked up the dish towel without being asked. Remembering the way Carter had looked at her when she did. My phone buzzed. A message from Paige lit up the screen. "Thank you for showing me what family means. I didn't deserve that seat, but you gave it anyway." I read it twice. Then I set the phone down and looked around. The chairs were back in place. The counter cleared. The last of the leftover containers stacked in the fridge. My apron still hung on the hook, faint smudges on the hem. It wasn't perfect. There were still things unsaid, hurts not fully healed. But maybe that's not what mattered most. I stood, refilled my cup, and opened the window. Outside, the sun had just crested the roofline, spilling light across the porch and into the garden beds. Birds sang distant but clear. Somewhere a child laughed. Probably down the street, the family with the blue front door. The world was moving on. But here in my kitchen, something had paused, settled. There was room now. For honesty, for change, for something new at the table. And as I leaned against the counter, coffee warming my palms, I realized I wasn't waiting anymore. I was ready.